Well, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Charles Horner, a senior fellow here at Hudson Institute, and I'm happy to welcome all of you to a discussion we're going to have about Taiwan and hopefully about Taiwan's relation with China and with the United States, but mostly with the world at large. We had planned, and some of you will appreciate this, to stream this event on the World Wide Web, but our streaming service has reported that it was hacked by the Russians, which, though we are outraged to hear this here at Hudson Institute, it does have a certain whiff of nostalgia for us. Frankly, we're disappointed that this event has not been hacked by the Chinese, which indicates they just don't know us well enough yet, and they don't know where we're coming from. But we are hopeful that after they have an opportunity to see the tape of this, that they will understand that the next time we talk about China, they should do their damnedest to shut it down. We're happy for this event for a couple of reasons. One, because we have two friends from far away, and in the best Confucian tradition, we like to welcome guests from afar. Our speaker will be Huang Guibo, who's here from Taiwan. And as your description of the event will tell you, he's here for a short stay at our, I won't say sister institution, I will say our cousins at the Brookings Institution around the corner. And we think, therefore, it's good for him to spend a little bit of time with us, merely to get some, how shall I say, exposure to a broader outlook on things. And also our friend John Lee from Australia, from the faculty of the University of Sydney, and an increasingly influential and important commentator on Chinese affairs. Also I'm not sure of his exact title, I believe adjunct visiting fellow of Hudson Institute, which means he comes to see us every so often, and we're just very happy that this has happened today. It's very fortuitous. The discussion about Taiwan, its relation with China, as you all know, is very old, goes back to 1949, and of course historically it goes back way before then. But it's particularly salient now for a couple of reasons. Earlier this year, there was a presidential election in Taiwan, and there was an orderly election. There have been transfers of powers. Taiwan has become a fully functional constitutional democracy. It's a multi-party system with all of the things that one knows and recognizes in a mature and successful democratic state, and also very prosperous. This is also the year where we experience every 10 years what's known as the transfer of power in the People's Republic of China, something which has been orchestrated for years, for months, for weeks, and yet somehow, as all of you have noted in the press accounts coming from China in the past few weeks, become increasingly frayed about the edges. And frayed in a certain way. It's not merely that there's contention, which you would expect, but a certain kind of ugliness to the contention. The harassment and tormenting of Mr. Chun, of which you've heard. And also these increasingly sordid tales, whether they're true or not, about this man Bo Xilai off there in the western part of China. So that the issue is being fought out on the basis of accusations, even of murder, not to say corruption and other things like that. And this, for us, highlights a very important trend, important thing that's going on inside the Chinese world. We were talking before that, before we came out here, about how it is that in the Chinese world for a long time now, there's been a movement toward democracy, if you will, toward the realization of rights-based government protections and so on. And this has been achieved in Taiwan, and one hopes that it will begin to be achieved and consolidated in the rest of the Chinese world. And that gives Taiwan a particular importance beyond the normal importance of it as a friend and ally of the United States, with a strategic role to play in the future of Asia and of the world. And so with that, I will just introduce Guibo. Will say what he has to say, and then John will say what he has to say, and then we will have as lively a discussion as we possibly can. Here or there?
Maybe I just sit here because the audience on the right might not be able to see me if I stand. Okay, thank you very much, Charles and John, and ladies and gentlemen. Great honor to be invited to speak to you, very knowledgeable and concerned audience with special interest in the Taiwan Strait and East Asia in general. My past experience is a teaching professor at National Cheng University in Taipei. I should say accidentally, I was called to the government so that I tended to know more about how this current administration of Ma Ying-jeou is thinking in terms of planning. It's not only foreign policies, but also national security strategy. So even though I left the government, returned to this campus last year, but I think I can still share with you some of my personal observations, not only on the general context of East Asia, but specifically on Taiwan and its relations with mainland China. Let me begin by saying something about the key term in the title of my talk, that is the emerging Asian order. People know Asia, especially East Asia, is changing dynamically. Some places where you used to have a lot of conflicts, like the Taiwan Strait, now becomes more stable and more peaceful. But other areas, like the Korean Peninsula, it tends to be problematic all the time. And the South China Sea, it was violent in a short period of time, and it was then peaceful, especially after the signing of the declaration to the parties in the South China Sea in 2002. But in recent years, especially recent 1.5 years, I would say, the South China Sea seems to become another flashpoint in East Asia again. So changes always happen, and no one can actually predict the real trend of these critical issues in East Asia. But if I may, I would like to identify 3 big trends or big emerging order that could take place in East Asia in probably the following 5 or 6 years. The first big trend or the big emerging order might be the increasing involvement of great powers and the balancing power game played by the weak. So in a lot of things happening in East Asia, you can see the involvement of great powers is not avoidable. While you can also see the weak states, especially those in Southeast Asia, tend to group to play some cards with the strong so that they can get some bargaining chip with the strong states. And that's the game played by East Asian countries for now. And on the other hand, a lot of East Asian countries, especially in the Southeast Asia countries, tend to play a game of balance of power in order to include every possible major powers in the region, so the region can be more stable. I think that's their key strategy in this very dynamic regional context. And also you can see the involvement of great powers somehow can facilitate the compliance of words of the parties in dispute. So I think that's why most of the countries in the region are welcoming the involvement of great powers, but they tend to play the game of balance of power. And the second emergent order, I would say, is the existence of conflict management among concerned parties and the mediocre performance of regional or global institutions. This kind of emergent order leaves the states with one possible viable choice, that is self-help plus bandwagoning. Because that's the reality. Conflict management, it prevails, but mostly I would say it's between state and state concern. And sometimes it took place in a multilateral form, but rarely. And in most of the multilateral forms in the Asia Pacific, you can see, for example, the ASEAN Regional Forum, ARF. It doesn't work very well. And APEC, supposed to be an economic cooperation mechanism, now tends to deal partially with security issues, but it doesn't function that way, actually. What about in accordance to the international public law? Hard. Very few cases happening in East Asia have been sent to, say, the International Court of Justice. And for most disputes, especially territorial disputes, international laws are not the major way for those countries to consider in order to solve those disputes. And the last emerging order I would like to argue is that acquiring conventional weapons is still a key source to countries' self-confidence in order to engage with others. It might be a little bit against intuitive. It might be a little bit counterintuitive, but my personal argument is that with enough conventional weapons, can those countries in the dispute have more confidence to negotiate with the counterparts? So maybe there will be a greater willingness on the basis of appropriate military power of those countries in order to launch another round of talk. So if you think another way, maybe sometimes moderate arms race doesn't do harm too much to the region of the Asia Pacific. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but I'd like to raise it up for your consideration. Okay, so in such a context, what will Taiwan do, or what can Taiwan do to preserve its national survival and national well-being? Actually, President Ma, since he took office in 2008, May 2008, has tried very hard to plan out a blueprint in order to secure, to make Taiwan more secure, not only vis-a-vis mainland China, but vis-a-vis this very rapidly developing regional integration in the Asia Pacific. So he raised up his 3 defense lines in order to cope with these challenges or changes. But before I talk about the 3 defense lines, I have to say, that's my personal opinion, that these 3 defense lines are extremely difficult to implement. Without knowing the contents, please think it to yourself. How can a weaker Taiwan deal with mainland China successfully? That's the first question. And how can the public-private partnership be utilized to promote diplomacy? That's my second question. And how can Department of Defense and Department of State cooperate deeply to cope with diplomatic or military challenges overseas? In the States, I would say that would be some tough questions as well, not to mention in Taiwan. So actually, the 3 defense lines proposed by President Ma just touch upon the 3 critical questions, which I think, as I said, is very, very difficult. The first defense line for President Ma is a better institutionalization of cross-Strait talks. He aims to institutionalize Taipei-Beijing negotiations by peaceful engagement and rapprochement, while safeguarding Republic of China's sovereignty through 2 major means. The first means is cross-Strait talks on the basis of equality. So it cannot be the People's Republic negotiating with the KMT, the ruling party of Taiwan. It should be on an equal basis. So if you call my representative former Chairman Lian Chan, then I will call you Chairman Hu Jintao. On an equal basis is the key. And also, in order to institutionalize cross-strait exchanges, President Ma has encouraged people-to-people exchange as a foundation of better mutual understanding. And this, according to him, can result in the so-called benevolent cycles of cross-strait interactions. So what is the benevolent cycle or the benevolent cycles? Think about it. In the past, one of the major roots of cross-Taiwan Strait tension was diplomatic struggles. Either Taiwan bought one of PRC diplomatic allies to Taiwan's arm, or PRC grabbed one from Taiwan's camp. Both sides of the Taiwan Strait were playing the checkbook diplomacy. So now, President Ma would like to ease the tension by calling for flexible diplomacy and diplomatic truce, no more fighting, no more struggling for diplomatic recognition. So this sort of tension in diplomacy can be largely reduced. And the reduction of tension in that regard will in turn lead to a better interactions between Taipei and Beijing. And hopefully, because it's only about 4 years, hopefully, with these better interactions between Taipei and Beijing in the future, Beijing will have a new look at Taiwan's international space. And with that possibly better diplomatic interactions or better Taiwan's international space, can cross-Taiwan Strait relations improve deeply? Then that becomes a benevolent cycle, rather than the vicious cycle in the past, where the two sides struggled vehemently for diplomatic truce and they hated each other without directed channels of communication. That's the first defense line, institutionalization of cross-strait talks. So as I said, it's very difficult for a weak Taiwan to deal with the strong mainland China by proposing that. And the second defense line of Taiwan proposed by Ma is to strengthen comprehensive power for Taiwan's national survival. In that regard, Taiwan needs to use economic and scientific and technological capabilities through some limited channels to feed back to the international community. Because in the 1950s and the early 60s, Taiwan was one of the major recipients of US and United Nations aid. And now Taiwan has stood up, and we are capable of paying back to the international community's help. So we need to muster all the possible capabilities, not only in the government, but also in the civil society, the third sector, in order to help Taiwan be a more responsible stakeholder in the international community. And meanwhile, Taiwan needs to share more responsibilities in terms of carrying out some humanitarian diplomacy missions. That's why I ask my second question. Is it possible to have a very nice public-private partnership in order to promote your diplomatic goals or national security goals? It's not very easy, but that's something President Ma is endeavoring to do in order to better Taiwan's national security, by constructing the second line of defense. That is, make Taiwan more respectable, more responsible in the international community. And the last defense line proposed by Ma is a quality national defense supported by diplomacy. That's why I ask my third question. It is very easy for Department of Defense and Department of State to cooperate in order to promote diplomacy and national defense. Not that easy. To make it short, I think President Ma's main idea is to use diplomacy as a leverage to generate better relations with Taiwan's diplomatic allies and major countries that are important to Taiwan, especially the United States. With sufficient consultations and candid cooperation between Taiwan and these major partners, friends, can Taiwan's national defense be consolidated? And can these major allies, partners, even provide some necessary help, either militarily or economically or morally, to Taiwan? So the three defense lines are not that confrontational. They are very idealistic, but I think worth trying, because I think if Taiwan continues to take some confrontational measures against mainland China, that's not only the problem mainland China is going to face, but also the other parties concerned are going to face, like what happened between 2002 to 2008, Taiwan-mainland China relations, which was a pain for many people. Okay, so by saying that, I think it's also important to know, since Taiwan has tried very hard to safeguard its national security, to promote its international responsibility, to improve cross-strait relations, then how come there are still some misunderstandings about Taiwan with the improvement of its relations with Beijing, with its greater willingness to engage with the international community? Let me throw out three possible, I would say, mistaken arguments made by some people, either here in town or in some other regions of the world. The first mistaken argument, assumptions, is the improvement in cross-Taiwan Strait relations will weaken Taiwan's strategic position in the U.S. policy towards the Asia-Pacific, which means Taiwan will be the weakest link in U.S. Asia-Pacific strategy with the improvement of cross-Taiwan Strait relations, which is very odd to me. Some people, especially in Washington, D.C., have begun to argue that the U.S. should consider abandoning Taiwan for three most commonly seen reasons. One, they argue Taiwan is a source of destabilization in U.S. mainland China relations, so U.S. better abandon Taiwan as soon as possible. And the second argument they made is the betterment of cross-strait relations will lead Taiwan to the communist side and cause a security dilemma of the United States in the Asia-Pacific. So the quicker you throw Taiwan away, the better for your national security and interest. And the third argument they made is the abandonment of Taiwan can serve as a bargaining chip to persuade mainland China to write off the some $1 trillion of American national debt, which is even more weird. The only thing I can say about the three mistaken arguments is that I think most of these arguments were made by realists, some of whom are really very, very famous realists with unrealistic ideas. So they are realistics with unrealistic ideas. Because in terms of the importance of Taiwan to the U.S. Asia-Pacific strategy, there shouldn't be any good reason for U.S. to considering ditching Taiwan. For example, if U.S. really decides to ditch Taiwan, I think that will bring up an image of a weak and unreliable U.S. that can be pushed around by a Chinese Communist Party. And two, if Taiwan is in the arm of the People's Republic of China, then the latter could militarize Taiwan in order to remove strategic advantages of the U.S. in the region. And the third reason I would make a counter-argument about that is actually U.S. arms sale to Taiwan can be stabilizing rather than destabilizing. The reason is just like what I argued before. With appropriate self-defense capability, can Taiwan be more confident to negotiate with mainland China? Or you can imagine, what if Taiwan is now lacking its national defense capability, like a small tiger without teeth, without claws? Then would the attitude of mainland China toward Taiwan be the same? I seriously doubt. And the fourth possible reason to make an counter-argument is that the shared value between Taiwan and U.S. As Charles just mentioned, or he implied, Taiwan has been a democracy with free market. These are the common values shared by both Taiwan and the U.S. Then how come the U.S. should abandon such an important ally with so many important shared values in the Asia Pacific and embrace a big country that shared literally almost nothing in common with the U.S. except the size of the country, the population? And the last reason why I don't think ditching Taiwan is a good idea is that actually maintain status quo in the Taiwan Strait could be the advantage considered by both the U.S. and mainland China. So status quo is not only the best for Taiwan, but also best for the U.S. and mainland China for now. That's why I think people making such an argument about abandoning Taiwan should be considering these arguments even further in order to put forth to a more responsible arguments for healthy interactions between U.S. and Taiwan. And these arguments will lead to the next mistaken argument made by others. That is, the improvement in cross-Taiwan relations will weaken Japan's strategic interests in the Asia Pacific because Taiwan and mainland China, they are all Chinese. They will be united as one against Japan. That argument has prevailed, especially, I would say, 5 years, 10 years ago. But I would like to argue that just look at the reality, look at the facts describing a very robust relationship between Taiwan and Japan. You can hardly say that the improvement of cross-Taiwan Strait relations will harm Japan's interest. For example, just last year, Taiwan and Japan signed an investment protection agreement, which can serve as a foundation for a future free trade agreement between the two parties. And now Taiwan can have a so-called intercity flight with Japan from Taipei City's Songshan Airport, that's in Taipei City, like here's Reagan National Airport. It's in Taipei City. People can have a direct flight to the Haneda Airport in Tokyo, which saved a lot of people's time. And that agreement wasn't done before. But because Japan now knows the importance of the timing to take advantage of the improving relationship between Taipei and mainland China, Taipei and Beijing. So Japan now agrees to sign the agreement with Taiwan so that the intercity flight could be opened, which is also a positive sign of Taiwan-Japan relations. And the trade volume between Taiwan and Japan reached over $7 billion US. 70 billion US dollars in 2010. Last year is a historical height. And last year, the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. Taiwan is the #1 country that donated the financial aid, foods, products to Japan, which even further benefit the bilateral relationship between Japan and Taiwan. So last October, in our National Day celebration party, Japan sent 66 congresswomen to Taipei, reaching the historical high as well. So based on all these facts, I doubt why an improvement in Taipei-Beijing relations will damage Japan's strategic interest or will weaken Taiwan-Japan relations. I don't see that point. And also, in terms of U.S.-Japan security alliance, Taiwan has shown its firm support for it. For example, President Ma just said, he said actually many times, as long as regional arrangements can be helpful for peace and stability of East Asia, he will endorse it. He supports it, including U.S.-Japan security alliance. So, as I said, we should separate Taipei-Beijing relations and Taipei-Tokyo relations because the two can develop in a positive way at the same time. And the last mistaken argument I would like to say is that the improvement in cross-Taiwan Strait relations will unite Taiwan and mainland China to counter those parties making claims over either the Diaoyutai Senkaku Islands or the South China Sea. It's very important to know that President Ma has reiterated that Taiwan will never cooperate with mainland China to solve the territorial disputes around Taiwan. And Taiwan is willing to negotiate with the parties involved in order to have a joint exploration of resources or to safeguard the freedom of navigation in those disputed waters. That's what Taiwan has argued for many, many years. But still, some people would say now the betterment of cross-Taiwan Strait relations will lead to a cooperation between Taiwan and mainland China against the other parties, which Taiwan say never. Taiwan will never do that. And also, another thing for your consideration is that if mainland China can use a more peaceful way to deal with Taiwan issues, and if mainland China is using its better relations with Taiwan as a showcase to demonstrate its so-called harmonious world theory proposed by Hu Jintao, then I think that will become a restraining factor on People's Republic of China's external behavior. Because if on the one hand, mainland China is treating Taiwan nicer, but on the other hand, mainland China is so assertive, so aggressive towards the Senkaku Diaoyutai Islands or the South China Sea, then how can Taiwan people believe that the so-called harmonious society or harmonious world theory can really apply to Taiwan? So in a way, I think Taiwan can be of help to mitigate some of the pressures imposed by mainland China. So I think I've said enough. by concluding my talk, I would like to argue that it's an extremely tough task for President Ma Ying-jeou to deal with mainland China and the world that's not very friendly to Taiwan. And for him, I think one of the most important tasks is to stabilize Taiwan society, especially in a political sense, because the division of the political parties is very deep and so difficult to resolve. And also, for President Ma, he needs to construct Taiwan as a responsible stakeholder with democratically and economically robust system. And also, he needs to show that Taiwan has the strong will of self-defense so that the people, especially those major countries willing to help, can come to help. And also, I would like to say that the other parties concerned, probably especially the United States, should play an impartial and supportive role in encouraging constructive and fact-based dialogues between Taipei and Beijing. When I serve in the government, sometimes I welcome my friends overseas, and we had dinner or we had a short talk. Some of them would say, hey, we know now your relationship with mainland China is getting better and better. And now we also know you have a strong desire for greater international space. So how come you don't just go speak to Beijing first? If you both agree, then we will agree. And I believe some people in Beijing also say the same thing to my foreign guests, that let Taipei and Beijing deal with it first. I mean the international space issue first. Then, if both Taipei and Beijing agree, you don't have to worry about your choice, your selection. You just say you agree, because we both have agreed. But that's not what Taipei expects. That's what Taipei wants. Mainly because we need the support of the international society in order to negotiate with mainland China over Taiwan's international space. Without international support, you can imagine how much pressure mainland China would exercise in order to persuade or pressurize Taiwan into the corner. So international support is also a key to Taiwan, but such a support should not become the intervening force in the Taiwan Strait, but a supporting force, as I said, to encourage a constructive and fact-based dialogues between the two regimes. And last, I would like to say that even though now you see a dramatic change, positive change in Taiwan-mainland China relations, but we in Taiwan know there's a glass ceiling in it. This glass ceiling can be seen from 2 points. The first point, Taiwan's NGO engagement with the international community. Now and then, we still find out some obstacles set up by the PRC to prevent Taiwan's NGOs from entering some UN-related buildings or UN-sponsored meetings. So, no matter how great mainland China argued about the progress of cross-Taiwan Strait relations, but people in Taiwan will never feel that way if their international engagement has been prevented, blocked by Beijing. And the second point I would like to make about this glass ceiling argument is that mainland China hasn't become a democracy. So a lot of us in Taipei firmly believe the the criterion of judging the distance between Taipei and Beijing is human rights and democracy. That is, if China doesn't democratize, if China doesn't pay high respect to human rights and democracy values, then the improvement of Taipei-Beijing relations will have a limit. There will be a limit. And so we have to wait and see whether or not mainland China can really transform into a more democratic regime so that we can expect the next stage of cross-Taiwan Strait relations to happen. So I think I took up too much time now. So maybe I can leave it to John for your comments and look for your questions. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. It's a pleasure to share a panel with Weibo, my colleague Charles, and I also want to thank Eric Brown, my colleague here, for inviting me to speak in this panel. Now, I certainly have a genuine appreciation for the kind of dilemmas that Taiwan faces. If you compare Taiwan to my country, Australia, we're both roughly 22, 23 million people. In Australia, the conversation is all about how we can best take part in the growing economic opportunities in the region, how we can be what many people in Canberra term an active, clever middle power. But all of those objectives seem somewhat trivial compared to what Taiwan's going through. And what I mean by that is Taiwan is not just out to seek continued economic prosperity and relevance, but they're also seeking to protect their very way of life against what I see as an increasingly impatient and obviously much larger country in China. So I open by way of this just to say that I have quite a profound appreciation of the dilemmas facing your country. Now, with this as an opening, with this as a context, I thought I'd spend maybe 10 minutes at most just talking about the prospects for Taiwan's economic and strategic positioning in a region. Now, Taiwan, as we know, is a significant valued economic partner or economic play in the region. Its emphasis on such high-value things as biotech, green energy, organic farming, IT applications, etc., that's all good. That is all good for Taiwan to emerge as a significant value-add economic player in the region. But I think the harsh reality that we have to face is that Taiwan's economic role, that is as a trade partner and as a destination for foreign direct investment, is not big enough or important enough in itself to alter the strategic orientation of major capitals in a region when it comes to the cross-Straits issue. So, for example, if we look at trade, two-way trade between China and Taiwan is about $110 billion. This is 30% more than the trade that Taiwan has with the ASEAN countries and with Japan, and it's twice as large as the trade volume with the United States. Likewise, the combination of inward and outward investment with the PRC is almost $13 billion compared to about US $1.5 billion with the US, $2 billion with the ASEAN nations, and $650 million with Japan. Now, the point is that China is far more important to Taiwan as an economic partner than any other country, while China is far more important as an economic partner for every other major country in the region than Taiwan. Now, as you know, China is the largest trading partner of Japan, of South Korea, of the major ASEAN countries, of Australia, and the largest Asian trading country of India and the United States. Now, in contrast, Taiwan's share of global imports and exports has been falling gradually for over a decade. Now, this means that Taiwan does not have the economic role and therefore the leverage that it once did before China's rise. And when it comes to using economics and trade to position itself vis-a-vis other countries, Taiwan is not in a position today that it once was and is unlikely to ever recapture that position. So as China becomes larger and more economically dynamic, corresponding Taiwanese economic leverage decreases. Now, I'm cautious about arguments, which you do hear in Taipei occasionally, that increased economic integration with the mainland will play a decisive role in transforming the values of the mainland. That is, China's political values and foreign policy behaviour. Now, for a number of reasons, which I won't get into now, but if you'd like to talk about it during questions, I think this is just a pure fantasy. In my mind, having said all that, I think Taiwan's economic policy vis-a-vis the mainland is actually on the right path. For example, I think it's completely rational for Taiwan to have concluded the ECFA trade agreement, or the ECFA broad agreement in 2010 with China. There are undoubted relative and absolute gains for the Taiwanese as a result of this agreement. For example, it decreases Chinese import tariffs on many categories of Taiwanese goods to allow Taiwanese firms a more level footing with ASEAN and South Korean firms that have free trade agreements with China. It allows Taiwan to effectively benefit indirectly from China's free trade agreements with other countries, since Taiwan can take advantage of exports from the mainland, which enjoy low or zero tariffs from those countries. And more generally, in a globalized, or at least a regionalized production chain, an investment regime blocking PRC imports and investment doesn't actually make Taiwan economically stronger and render China economically weaker. In fact, prior to ECFA, all that was happening effectively was the marginalization of Taiwan as part of the regional production chain, given the raft of FTAs between Taiwan's traditional trade partners that excluded Taiwan. Now, for example, there have been, I think, around 100 free trade agreements signed by Asian countries. Taiwan has signed 5, and all of these are with Central and South American countries that constitute around 5% of Taiwan's trade. Now, China's going to have whatever it is, 1,500 or whatever it is, missiles pointed at Taiwan, and it's not going to repeal its anti-succession law no matter what Taipei's economic policy is. So therefore, Taiwan might as well benefit economically from China's rise, since the economic and the strategic in this context, I don't think are related. Finally, beyond economic self-interest, Taiwan needed to change the perception that it is an economic or diplomatic bottleneck in the region when it came to China in an economic, narrow economic context. Greater economic integration into East Asia and agreements such as ECFA helps to do that. For example, ECFA provides a ready-made framework for Taiwan to negotiate free trade agreements with other countries, such as the one being discussed with Singapore. Now, because any free trade regional agreement with Taiwan still effectively requires China's agreement consent, because few countries are willing to incur the wrath of China, it puts the pressure on Beijing to behave as what it self-proclaims to be a benevolent and civilized economic power, rather than a wrathful and objectionist economic power. Now, this potentially, and I mean potentially, increases the international space for Taiwan. For example, Beijing might well block or diplomatically resist any free trade agreement between Taiwan and Singapore that is modelled on the ECFA agreement, but that would just increase the diplomatic heat on Beijing to explain why it's doing so. Now, so it's important that Taiwan is perceived as a constructive economic partner or economic player, rather than an irrational bottleneck or trouble-making economic country in the region. But I think no economic manoeuvring by itself will deliver Taiwan protection or security, because, as I mentioned, Taiwan is simply not important enough as an economic partner of every major country in the region. Now, the key to Chinese restraint in cross-strait relations, in my mind, is obviously the effectiveness of deterrent mechanisms in place. And this obviously depends on America's East Asian resolve and policies in the Indo-Pacific. Now, in my view, and from the point of view of Taipei, if I were in the government in Taipei, this is the way I would see it. I think there are three important aspects. The first is for Taiwan to successfully and relentlessly put forward the case that Beijing's cross-strait policy and behavior is the litmus test and indicator of Beijing's future behavior if it achieves eventual East Asian dominance. Now, this might seem obvious to many of you, but there is a common line of argument throughout the region and maybe in America, one which emanates out of mainland China, and that is that China will be a much more contented and inward-looking power once it resolves the Taiwan question in its favor. Now, I don't think the evidence actually brings that out, and I think much can be made by Taipei of that. Indeed, whether Beijing uses force to take back a territory that it claims but doesn't actually rule over or control, therefore distinguishing Taiwan from Xinjiang or Tibet, should be a lead indicator of Beijing's future behavior. Now, second, if I were in Taiwan, I would do my best, and Weibo spoke a little bit about this, to convince Washington and regional capitals that how America responds to any Straits crisis, or any PRC-initiated Straits crisis, is the litmus test of how credible, robust, and durable the regional alliance system actually is. And I think this is not just a convenient but a credible argument, because any American hesitancy over a PRC-initiated Straits crisis would cause allies such as Japan and my country, Australia, to fundamentally re-evaluate our strategic orientation in the region. Finally, assuming the first and second conditions are met, I think Taiwan should try to support what I call a strategic holding pattern and maintain stability and the strategic status quo, because this could be to Taiwan's advantage in the long term. Now, due to mainland China's size and its growing economic power, I think it's quite common to assert that time is on China's side and all China has to do is bide its time, and sooner or later it will get its way. But we have to remember that China is currently in a structural purple patch of opportunity, and this period of window of opportunity for mainland China will last forever. For example, China is becoming even more dependent on imported oil over the next decade, decreasing its tolerance for disruption to seaborne trade. China's demographics are terrible, and when it inevitably grows old before it grows rich as a country, such a low middle income country per capita, which it undoubtedly be, means that it's next to impossible for China to grow rapidly beyond the next decade. Now, when China started reforms in 1979, there were almost 8 working people to every retiree. In 10 years' time, there will be 3.5 working people for every retiree in 2020, and in 2035, there will be 2.2 working people for every retiree. Now, I'm pushing this point because unlike other East Asian countries that are growing old, Japan, South Korea, China has not catered for the onset of retirees in its system. Very few people have pensions, 10% perhaps. These pensions aren't funded. A lot more resources will have to go into internal domestic causes, and this will, one, restrict the amount of resources China has available in the long term, and two, will also increase the consequences of disruption, of foreign policy disruption to Beijing, and make it more prohibitive in the long term compared to the short term. Finally, China's fixed investment growth model is becoming dangerously inefficient. Every economist recognizes that it's not sustainable. Now, in 10 or 20 years' time, China will still have an enormous economy, but its domestic problems will have worsened. Every domestic indicator you have unrest, for example, healthcare, every domestic problem that governments have to face, all those indicators are getting worse for China. So the point I'm making is that time may not necessarily be on China's side. It's in Taiwan's abiding interest to maintain a strategic holding pattern, and a future resolution of the cross-Straits issue could be more favorable to Taiwan the longer the strategic status quo holds out. The summary, I suppose, is that China's tolerance for foreign policy mistakes and the disruption that comes from foreign policy mistakes will grow rather than lessen, and I think that is Taiwan's hope. Now, I think I'll end there. I think we have 45 minutes for questions.
We do have some time for questions, and I will refer the concluding remarks that John made to management around here, because it seems that maybe we ought to have one of these, which should be entitled, "Will the PRC be secure in the emerging Asian order?" which is a very significant question, and maybe even, if I may say, a more important question, whether Taiwan will be so or not. We have time for questions. The moderator, I guess by his title, is supposed to moderate. I hope not to do that, but this would be more of a provocateur and encouraging people to ask pointed but brief questions. So if you identify yourself and ask your question, that will be fine. And with just as much time as we have. Yeah, here is our colleague Max Singer, also a senior fellow at Hudson Institute, perhaps the senior most. This way.
Both of your speakers have been presented us with a very thorough and rational description of the key issues. But both of you talked about China in a completely unitary way, as if there was a China policy and China was an actor. I've heard other people talk about the lack of unitariness in Chinese policy making, so that the foreign ministry has one policy, and the foreign ministry has one policy, and the Navy has one policy, and the Army has a policy, and the party has a policy, and they often operate rather independently of each other. And I wonder to what extent you think that point of view about the divisions in China is important to take into account in thinking about what might happen.
We take one question, or we collect several.
Oh, no, just deal with the one one at a time. It's simple.
I have a short memory here.
Okay.
Okay. Very quickly, I mean, it's correct that China is not homogenous and all these different entities do conflict with each other. But when it comes to the Taiwan question, in my mind, they differ only in tactics or in the way they might like things to be done. But every single interest group, as far as I can see, is united in what they want out of Taiwan. That is reunification. I don't think there's any room. Well, I mean, you know, it makes predicting what, in the event of some kind of crisis, it makes predicting what would happen impossible because of that lack of both transparency and lack of homogeneity. But, you know, I guess all I can say is my earlier comment that they both, well, all groups want the same thing, reunification, and no, we can't predict how a crisis will play out, but we'll predict what they want out of crisis.
Just say one thing about the term reunification, which implies that there once was a disunity that needs to be reunified, as if the analogy is between East and West Germany and North and South Korea. It's not quite that way. Indeed, the claim of PRC that Taiwan is a part of it is an untenable one. Indeed, the connection between Taiwan as a part of China, which was disunified, if there's such a word, or is separated, or that what PRC is trying to do is to restore a situation that existed at some point in the past, and that is not the historical situation of Taiwan, which maybe you could argue for 5 years in its history was governed by a Chinese government that claimed to be both the government on the mainland and Taiwan. Not even in the pre-Republic of China times was Taiwan part of anything called China. I mean, so this is it's not, but they've been enormously successful in creating this idea that there's an analogy between the East and West Germany and North and South Korea. That was once a country, it was divided. Now it needs to be put back together. So even I would hope my good friend, this is his friend, reunification. I myself, being a provocateur and rather than a moderator, prefer the term Anschluss, which reflects more accurately the relation between these two entities, as between the relation between Germany and Austria and other German-speaking places, and some place called Germany. And so to say that one does not favor a China-Taiwan Anschluss is a perhaps more accurate way of discussing the question of so-called whether the one country should be reunified. And now I have my friend, a diplomat from the foreign ministry,
and not a real diplomat, actually. I just be quick as well. I tend to buy the argument that the general foreign policy of mainland China is not made by Hu Jintao solely. It was made in general by those less than 10 people in the Politburos, major people in the Politburo and Task Force on Foreign Affairs. And in terms of PRC's Taiwan policy, it's the task force of the Taiwan policy within the Chinese Communist Party. Of course, these different major officials, party cadres, represented respected ministries or bureaus that have their own turfs. So, for example, the South China Sea, at least the influence would have come from the PLA Navy, the Fishery Administration, the Coast Guard, and probably local government, local provinces. So I don't know the complex inside black box of the foreign policy decision making of mainland China on that regard, but I know at least the output will be discussed collectively, probably not by Hu Jintao himself. And also in terms of his Taiwan policy, I think also the same thing. Don't think most of the PRC ministries or government agencies would favor such a Taiwan policy. Of course, the Taiwan Affairs Office under the State Council would push a more benign Taiwan policy. But my friend told me that the Ministry of Commerce on the mainland side, for example, would be against such a benign policy because the major goal of the Commerce Ministry is to make money. But such a benign policy toward Taiwan is what people in mainland China called yielding profits to Taiwan, which works against the principle of Ministry of Commerce and also the Ministry of Agriculture as well. So not all ministries are buying the argument made by the Taiwan Affairs Office. So Taiwan Affairs Office is sometimes having difficulties negotiating with other agencies. But as I say, the final output must have been discussed and finalized by a collective leadership. That's my hunch.
I'm Mike Fonte. I'm the DPP's Washington liaison here in Washington. I don't think there's any serious policy person who accepts the so-called realist argument about abandoning Taiwan. But the policy people have some worries about Ma abandoning the U.S. And I think there's some interesting markers on that have to be raised. That is, the flow of officials of Taiwan that go to China is a lot bigger than the flow that come to the United States. There's been, in some people's mind, a significant downplaying, it seems, of the U.S. relationship. But I think the key marker that I would ask you about which way is Ma leaning, comes with the defense budget. President Ma promised a 3% of GDP defense budget. Every year in his administration, the defense budget has gone down. It's now, I think, at 2.1% or something in that range. So the question to you is, how can you expect to have a serious dialogue based on confidence with the PRC unless you have serious multi-layered deterrence? And I don't think the Ma administration's approach to its defense issues is really shows that, and that's why I think people here are worried that it will allow the PRC to miscalculate about Taiwan's intentions.
Okay. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak on something I believe Ma is doing right, that is to enhance Taiwan's defense capability while taking into account the economic reality. Because now Taiwan is also suffering from its economic downturn. And sometimes, the domestic opposition in Taiwan will find fault with President Ma for whatever he decides to do. That's democracy. That's democracy. So, Ma promised that the minimum defense budget will be 3%, but he failed to do it. I think that's a pity. But looking at the current economic situation, I would say, to me, that's a rational decision not to pour so much resources to the defense side while turning back to help the domestic society first. But I believe with a better economic development starting from last year, President Ma is going to try his best to meet the 3% GDP in terms of the defense budget. That's just my hunch.
Anyone, if we're, the other fellows back here with the coffee cup there.
Can we follow up on hi, I'm Richard Moss, and I was teaching at Lingtung University in Taichung in 2004, 2005. So may we go back to the years that the Greens were in power, and with respect to the defense budget, I think the KMT was voting consistently against the budget, but I may not be right. And then this is simply to clarify things that were said around faculty rooms. Is it true that there are 1,000 missiles always aimed at Taiwan?
Over.
And is it true also that Taiwan, especially after 101 was built, it could be decapitated very quickly? That was the kind of language that was used. But my students had no fear.
Yeah, I think in general, in brief, Taiwan's defense budget during the Chen Shui-bian years might be a little bit higher than the average amount of the Ma administration. That's just my hunch. I am not quite sure. But those years, Taiwan's economy was relatively okay. That's my key point. And also, when the arms sales deal was proposed by Washington, and I think that surprised Taiwan by knowing that the amount would reach about 200 billion. 20 billion. 20 billion US dollars. And that would have eaten up our 3-year national defense. That is, we couldn't spend a penny to a soldier, but spent the 3 full years national defense budget to buy those big packages, which might be of help for Taiwan, but in reality, I think that was why the then KMT, the then KMT legislators had concern. So with the referendum, people said no to such a big package. I think that, in brief, was in the story behind the scene, I think.
Let me try and get somebody in the back. These are excellent questions, by the way. They are good and they're provocative and excellent. So let's keep this going here.
Thank you so much, Charles. My name's Tony, Central News Agency, Taiwan. And question to Mr. Wang, what's your advice to Mr. Ma regarding the long-term solution to arms sales? Each year it's going to be kind of disturbing points to U.S. administration at the time they want to advance the relationship with China, but somehow want to stabilize Taiwan's situation as well. So on the standpoint of Taiwan, and what's your advice to President Ma? Thank you.
Okay, just 2 points. First, the construction of Taiwan's self-defense capability comes mostly from the U.S. So basically, the plan will be after a series of negotiation consultations between Taiwan and the U.S. And it's not, the decision is not made by Taiwan single-handedly. And I bet most probably the U.S. will have a say about it. So if you ask me about the long-term plan or long-term suggestions to President Ma's national defense plan or strategy, I think sometimes we have to ask our American friends. And another thing is that while Taiwan is building up its defense capability, Taiwan needs to consider 2 points. One, Taiwan needs to build up its own necessary, appropriate defense capability while helping U.S. build up necessary military capability in the region so that the U.S. Asia-Pacific strategies won't be damaged, as some people worried. Like when the improvement of cross-Taiwan Straits takes place, then Taiwan will abandon the U.S., move towards mainland China. That's my 2 cents.
We've got time for about one more question. Actually, I'm going to be the person to ask it because ordinarily I wish would have planted the question with someone in the audience, but I can't resist circuiting this process, which is to ask both of our speakers to comment on this whole huge amount of recent news, both from China and from the United States in the world of diplomacy and politics, which consists in part of the news we've heard about the power struggle in China, about the growing conspicuous attention being paid to human rights movement in China, the U.S. Now famous pivot to Asia, the recent visits, the pronouncements of the secretary, all of these sorts of things, and what this whole, I don't know what the right word is, potpourri, bouillabaisse of stuff has to do with this connection, how it will relate in some way to Taiwan over the longer term. So let me ask John to do that first, and then Weibo can wrap up.
Well, very quickly, the U.S. pivot to Asia, as I understand it, is not just material and strategic, but moral. That is, it is a reassertion of American leadership in political and human rights. And I think there's a common misperception, which I don't know why it's there, but it's a common misperception that Asia doesn't care about human rights and democracy. I mean, the fact is that every major power in Asia, except for China, is a liberal democracy. And Asian countries just don't speak about democracy as publicly as Western countries do. But there is no doubt that the American reluctance to allow greater Chinese leadership in the absence of political reform is shared by every other major capital. So, I think there can be credible and constructive use made of recent events in China, the petition for asylum and so on, about where these countries stand and where Taiwan fits into this picture, and also that democracy and human rights and rule of law is really, and institutions is really what I like to emphasize. It's not just a Western thing. It is not something that is outside of the Chinese-speaking world. It's actually quite central to Asia and the Chinese-speaking people.
Yeah, I think what I'm going to say is that in those cases on mainland China, I think that just demonstrates a sharp difference between mainland China and Taiwan in terms of the core values shared by the people. So I think mainland China will be even more cautious of its domestic power struggle without leaking most of the stories out to the external world. And also, mainland China will be thinking about some other way to promote the so-called democracy with Chinese characteristics, if that's the right term. And my personal understanding is that some of my mainland Chinese friends are in favor of a Singaporean model. And we political scientists sometimes call the Singaporean model as a soft authoritarianism. And some of my colleagues in political science fields even don't regard Singapore as a democracy, because depending on the definition of democracy. But anyway, so mainland China, I think, can begin to think about the adoption of the Singaporean model in order to show to the world that mainland China is changing towards a more democratic way, but not your Western democracy, but some other democracy with Chinese characteristics or Asian value. And as to the U.S. pivoting to Asia, I think Taiwan, like many other Asian countries, would welcome this decision, because yes, the U.S. is always one of the most important actors in the region, and also those flashpoints in East Asia needs more U.S. tension, so that the tension will not escalate into armed conflict or even to more severe armed conflict. And the U.S. greater involvement in the Asia Pacific, I think, will also benefit Taiwan. And as long as the U.S. can abide by the Taiwan Relations Act, which is a U.S. domestic law, and its 6 assurances raised by President Reagan in 1982, I think U.S.-Taiwan relations will not be a liability to the U.S., but an asset to the region of the Asia Pacific.
Well, we need to stop now. I want to thank both of our speakers today from coming a long way for this. Thank all of you for coming. And as I say, we look forward to another event in our series about China, Asia, Taiwan, and the world.